Look, I can totally see why this show appeals to the middle-aged housewife with a husband that can't keep her satisfied, but to me, it was just uncomfortable to watch. Hello, you lovely lot, and welcome back to a brand new video here on my channel, the first video of 2025, can you believe it? If you are new here, hi, my name is Flora, and I like to talk about the theatre a lot. I'm not going to sit here and call myself a critic or theatre pundit. I merely have a lot of opinions about all of the shows I get to go and see, and I like sharing those opinions with you guys. And as you're probably about to learn, I feel very strongly about a lot of them. Today, if you couldn't tell by the title and thumbnail of this video, I'm going to be delving into all of my thoughts and feelings on the 2025 UK tour of Bat Out of Hell, which I was kindly invited to go and check out at the King's Theatre in Portsmouth. This is a show that up until recently I have never seen myself, but it's one I've heard a lot about, so I was very excited for the opportunity to check it out for myself at long last, and finally check it off my must-watch list. Now, before I get too far ahead of myself, I do always like to clue you guys in a little bit as to the history of the show, as well as a synopsis as to what the show is about, before I dive into my full review. So let's start with a little bit of the history of the production of Bat Out of Hell. Now, at its most basic, the history of Bat Out of Hell is basically that it was a musical that became a Meat Loaf album that became a musical again. But obviously, I want to give you guys a little bit more detail than that. Jim Steinman, the guy behind this musical, actually had the idea for it way back when he was in college in 1968. He actually wrote a newspaper article as a student detailing the struggles of his generation, and that kind of sparked the idea for a musical, which he originally called The Dream Engine. The staging of The Dream Engine was very much inspired by Brecht, with characters including a tribe of youths led by their leader Baal, who Steinman actually played himself. And this tribe of youths very much opposed these authority figures like the police and CEOs of big companies. The Dream Engine continued to evolve and eventually became a show called Neverland, which had a very similar story, but it had been depoliticized. Many of the songs featured in Neverland, along with some new ones, were used in Meat Loaf's album Bat Out of Hell, and after that, Bat Out of Hell, the musical we know today, came about, featuring the songs from this Meat Loaf album, combining story elements of both the Dream Engine and Neverland. 2015 saw Bat Out of Hell workshopped in New York before the show made its debut in the Manchester Opera House in 2017. Following massive success in Manchester, it transferred to the West End, first at the Coliseum, then to the Dominion. It also got a short 6-week run in New York, as well as a Las Vegas residency and international tour. Bat Out of Hell last toured the UK in 2023, but it's back now with dates throughout 2025. And because of all this, whilst it's technically a jukebox musical, it also isn't at the same time, because technically the musical came first, then the Meat Loaf album, although I feel like most people will most heavily associate it with Meat Loaf as opposed to the musical that came before Meat Loaf's album, if that makes any sense. For 2025, we also see a lot of returning cast members from previous productions, with the returning cast for the 2025 UK tour including Glenn Adamson as Strat, Sharon Sexton as Sloane, and Rob Fowler as Falco. There are also a lot of familiar faces in the cast for some of maybe my more Gen Z subscribers, including Katie Tonkinson as Raven, who some of you may recognise from the UK tour of Bonnie and Clyde, Georgia Udoka Davies, who was an alternate Heather Duke in the most recent Other Palace cast of Heathers, as well as Nat Pilkington, who most people will recognise from Six the Musical. But with that ever so brief history lesson about Bat Out of Hell as a musical out of the way, what exactly is Bat Out of Hell about? Bat Out of Hell takes us to a dystopian world where a gang called the Lost have been frozen in time as eternal teenagers stuck at the age of 18 for the most part. The story of the show unravels as their leader Strat falls in love with Raven, the daughter of Falco, who happens to be Strat's #1 enemy, primarily because he plans to destroy the Lost's home. Throughout the musical, we're also shown snippets of Falco's life and his relationship with his wife Sloane, who reminds him of his own wild youth. Meanwhile, tension starts to brew among the Lost because of Strat's relationship with Raven and the Lost's subsequent jealousy. The show claims to balance heartfelt family moments and romance with explosive action sequences. There are elements of both Peter Pan and Romeo and Juliet, both of which are remnants from The Dream Engine and Neverland, all of it coming together set to a sort of rock operatic score, with the songs being what most people would associate with Meat Loaf. I feel like something that's always worth clarifying before I do these reviews as well is whether I've seen the show before, because it helps you guys understand what perspective I went into the show with, if that makes sense. Now, Now, as I kind of hinted at in the introduction, I've never seen Bat Out of Hell before, and I must confess that I also don't really know Meatloaf's music that well. Through watching this show, I realized I knew more Meatloaf music than I thought I did. But if you'd asked me to name a Meatloaf song before the show, I think I'd really have struggled. So I went into the show armed with literally no knowledge aside from the synopsis on the website. But hopefully that brings you up to speed about the history of Bat Out of Hell, what the show's about, and what I knew about it prior to going in and seeing it. But I reckon it's time we get into my review. Now, please do bear in mind that this is by no means going to be spoiler free, as I don't feel like I can deliver all of my thoughts and feelings whilst keeping it vague enough that it won't spoil the show for you. And it also goes without saying, this is a Flower Theatre video, so of course it's going to be very opinionated. But if that sounds like something you're up for, buckle up because we have the highlights first. Now, my primary highlight for this show is definitely going to have to be the vocal performances. These were the absolute standout for the show for me, with the entire cast, in my opinion, being vocally flawless. The music of this musical is very operatic in a way, but it still needs that sort of rocky edge to it, meaning big voices are needed to carry off the overall sound of the show, and this cast certainly delivered on that. Standouts for me are definitely going to be Georgia Bradshaw as Zahara and Ryan Carter as Jaguar, both of whom have voices I could listen to for literally hours. As a pair, they sung songs like Dead Ringer for Love and 2 Out of 3 Ain't Bad, and they made these songs seem effortless, and that's always what I love to see. When singing these songs just seems to come so easy to the performers, I think it's really captivating. And then another highlight for me is definitely going to be the costumes. I think the costume designer John Borsa did a really good job with the costumes, more so the costumes of The Lost than anyone else, as I think they were the strongest visually when it came to the costumes on stage. The costumes for The Lost definitely had that grungy, youthful feel to them, and I'd definitely say John's take on the costumes felt a lot more like fantastical than say the 2017 costumes did, which from the images I've seen of them definitely looked a lot more like someone had raided a Hot Topic.
Because tonight will be the night that I will fall for you.
John definitely incorporated a lot more colour into the Lost's costumes as well. Before we saw colour palettes of greys and blacks, whereas now we're seeing a lot more denim and red, which I really liked as it helped the cast stand out against the stage, which was predominantly greys and blacks. I will say that because the costumes of the Lost, at least in my opinion, were the fun costumes in the show, Falco and Sloane's outfits were just like really underwhelming, with Falco and Sloane just kind of wearing like business attire in slightly out there colors, if that makes sense. I also feel like their costumes didn't do a good enough job of making them visually distinct from the Lost, because whilst yes, they were wearing sort of conventionally constructed garments, their color palettes were still dark and moody for the most part, blending them in pretty well with the color palettes that the Lost used. I think from a visual storytelling perspective, I would have liked to have seen Sloane and Falco, certainly Falco anyway, really dressing in a way that set him apart visually from the rest of the cast. I also think because they go through a transformation at the end of the show, the transformation was less impactful because actually their colour palettes haven't changed. They're just, ooh, they've got a bit of leather and a bit of glitter on. And so to me, I think that made that moment in the show lose impact as well. And that's something that could quite easily be tweaked just by changing the colour palette of what your characters are wearing. I also think, I know I've put this in highlight and then proceeded to moan about them, but I also think that these costumes do unfortunately fall into the same trap that a lot of rock musicals fall into, and that is that the costumes start to feel, at least in my opinion, like what a theatre kid thinks someone would wear to a rock concert, or like a theatre kid's interpretation of like a rock fan. And as someone who very much attends these kinds of concerts, I can confirm that it's not really like that. We Will Rock You has a very similar aesthetic, parts of School of Rock do, and even some productions of Green Day's American Idiot have this sort of very similar aesthetic, and I know stereotypes exist for a reason. It just feels, whilst they're fun and I liked the costumes, I feel like I'd seen them before, and if I had to say where I'd seen them before, it would just be in another rock musical. But that being said, like I said, they were still fun. The costumes of the Lost were fun, visually interesting, there was lots of textures, and it did feel very much like a rock and roll take on the Lost Boys of Neverland, which I think was fun. But those are my two highlights. Yeah, only two things, I know. So we're going to jump into the lowlights, and bear with me, I think it might be a little bit more rambly than usual just because I really struggled to break it down and segment it without sort of losing some of the points I wanted to get across. So hopefully it makes sense and it's not just like the ramblings of a mad woman, although I know that's how my videos tend to come across. let's dive into this together with our first lowlight, and that is going to be the story. As I said earlier, Bat Out of Hell is kind of a dystopian take on Peter Pan, and that's fine, don't get me wrong, but the Peter Pan of it all, I think, was just a little bit lost. You have some key parallels, right? Raven is quite clearly our Wendy. She has a really grumpy dad and a mum who's a little bit more supportive of her than the grumpy dad. You've got Strat, who is very clearly our Peter Pan of the story. The character Tink clearly represents Tinkerbell. A little bit on the nose if you ask me, but there you are. And then the Lost obviously are quite clearly our Lost Boys. And that's fine. Like, I know I've said it, it's fine, guys. But I feel like if you're gonna try and do like a Peter Pan parallel, you need to include all of the elements that make Peter Pan Peter Pan. You know, carrying on from that, the Lost, they don't age like how Peter Pan and the Lost Boys don't age. Like, all the core elements of Peter Pan are there, but also they're not at the same time. Falco wasn't enough of a parallel to Captain Hook for me. There was no real explanation for the beef between Falco and Strat besides Falco maybe just being a grumpy older man. At least Peter Pan did something that annoyed Captain Hook to kind of like justify Captain Hook's reaction. But I didn't see that between Strat and Falco. Now, I know the description of the show and the development of the show is kind of like inspired by Peter Pan, but I think because it's only loosely based on Peter Pan, but we also kind of want to tell our own story, the Peter Pan elements of it just end up becoming confusing because you're expecting a Peter Pan story, but it only gives you like half a Peter Pan story, but then it's not enough of its own story to stand on its own without the need of the sort of Peter Pan of it to support it. I think I would have preferred if they'd just gone all in on we're doing a dystopian retelling of Peter Pan set to Meatloaf music. I think that weirdly would have worked better than the kind of half in, half out telling that we got of the story. There was also a lot of plot points throughout that I feel like were dropped. There's mentions of Raven taking dream suppressants and then coming off the dream suppressants and dreaming for the first time in forever, and that fizzled out. That didn't really go anywhere. Likewise, I feel like the side characters weren't there to serve any other purpose besides we want to include these Meatloaf songs but don't feel like the four leads we have can keep singing every song, so let's give them to some side characters. Plot points like Zahara working for Falco literally led to nothing. I thought that would lead to something, but no. And I tend to fall in that category of like, don't give me exposition and don't give me details and facts and knowledge about this universe and then have it lead to nowhere. Because what was the point? You've just wasted, 10 lines on that, when actually we could have cut that and learned something more about something that was more pressing to the actual plot of the show. Also, this maybe is about to sound really harsh, but you could remove Falco and Sloane entirely from the show and I think the plot weirdly could have stayed the same. Raven's dad could have been a non-existent entity on the stage and we could just hear that he's a horrible man and she wants to run away and yah. He could be a disembodied voice and I think the show would not change at all. You'd just lose a few songs. And like, maybe that sounds overly harsh, but I definitely left the show with more questions than I went into it with, and I find that that's never a good thing because it means, at least in my opinion, you've not been able to tell your story succinctly enough, really, with the time that you've got. And then following on from that, I feel like the next couple of lowlights could definitely fall under story. I just wanted to like segment them because it makes it easier for my brain to understand, and so hopefully that makes it easier for you guys to follow along. Primarily, one of the big issues I had with the story, to the point it's getting its own lowlight point, is that I felt like there were no stakes. Aside from his occasional, I really hate Strat, or the Lost are terrible, Falco to me was just such a non-issue. Even though the synopsis told me he was supposed to be the big bad of the musical, I couldn't work out why he didn't like the Lost. At least in Peter Pan, Captain Hook doesn't like Peter Pan because Peter Pan cut off his hand and fed it to the crocodile, and the crocodile wanted to kill Captain Hook as a result of it. That makes sense, okay? Falco disliking Strat and subsequently disliking the Lost doesn't make sense, because as far as I could understand it in the show, Strat had never taken anything from Falco. I was just told a lot that there was beef between Falco and the Lost, but never really shown. Maybe I missed it. I just could not buy into this Falco versus the Lost plotline because it didn't really feel like there was any reason for it or that there were any stakes in it. Okay, Falco had his like 4 riot police looking guys attack someone with like a baton every now and then, but we never saw Falco actively plotting, really, particularly in Act 1, to get rid of the Lost. And there were just a few lines about how he for some reason wanted Strat dead sprinkled here and there. Obviously his actions in Act 2 kind of make it clearer that he wants to get rid of them, wants to eradicate the Lost, this, that and the other, but again, where was the motive? It just felt very lacking to me. For me, it mostly felt like he just had a bone to pick with them for no real reason, which makes him and his like company dicks, but I don't think that makes very high stakes for a musical. Why should I buy into this rivalry or this tension between these two people or these two groups when I don't really feel any tension and I don't really get what's at stake if one side was to win over the other? Also, speaking of Strat's death, right, which is something we hear Falco claim he wants a lot, Raven blames her dad, Falco, for Strat's death, which occurred at the end of Act 1 with the big Bat Out of Hell Act 1 finale. But then in Act 2, we're told he's dead because he drove his motorbike off a cliff. To me, that's not Falco's fault. Okay, maybe Falco made him flee, but I don't remember that happening. Like, Falco didn't make him get on his motorbike without a helmet and then drive it recklessly, ending in him flying off a cliff, did he? That was Strat's decision, and Strat's a big boy. He might be stuck in the body of an 18-year-old, but he's clearly been 18 for a very long time. You can't blame Falco for that directly, at least in my opinion. And so again, to me, that kind of just further removes threat from Falco. Moving on from that, because death doesn't really stick to anyone in the show, like literally nothing is gained or lost. And so like the overall arc of the story, like the characters don't really end up in a different place than when they started, or at least not many of them do. And so yeah, the total lack of stakes to me made it really hard to buy into the story and care about the characters and their struggles and what was going on, because I was just like, literally there's not an issue here. What are we doing? And maybe that sounds dumb, but that was my take on it. And then moving on, the kind of third issue I have to highlight in terms of issues with the story is that all of the redemption scene, at least to me, was entirely unearned. All throughout the show, there were moments that left me feeling entirely confused. It wasn't very clear where each character's heart lay, should I say. Sloane and Falco just seemed to argue, and then he ditched his business suit in favor of a leather jacket, and suddenly she wants to take him back. She's like, oh, we're all good. You've changed your fashion sense. I love you again. No. What? He's not earned it. He was horrible to you. He's not said sorry. He's just bought a new wardrobe. And then Raven forgave her parents very quickly as well. Again, her dad, bit of a dick to her. I say bit of a dick. He did try and kill her boyfriend for no real reason other than he just didn't like him. And so yeah, I just feel like she forgave her parents without any real reason. Like a lot of forgiving and making friends and, you know, hugging happened in the final number of the show that just like, it didn't feel justified in the context of the show I'd just watched. Everyone forgave everyone. Everyone was friends at the end. And so because of that and because of the show I just watched and the story all the characters have just been through, like it didn't feel satisfying. They've not actually done anything to earn this. There's not really been any character growth. Like I said, some of them just changed wardrobe and then bish bash bosh, they're all good. So yeah, as you can see, I had many issues with the story, and I think the story to me was jumbled and confused, and ultimately what let down what could have been a really brilliant musical, because as I said at the highlights, the music was so strong. But moving away from issues with the story, here are some other lowlights that I had throughout watching Bat Out of Hell. We're going to start off with a point that I've called artistic choices versus plot points. And that's because there were a lot of moments throughout the show where for me, it was hard to tell what was being made as an artistic choice versus what was actually a plot point I was supposed to be like paying attention to. And I feel like this is partly what contributed to the tell don't show vibe the whole show had going for it. Maybe I'm stupid, but key instances like Strat's death went completely over my head. I didn't know that him smothering himself in blood was supposed to be symbolic of him hoying himself off a cliff with his motorbike and then like getting injured and dying. I thought he was just feeling like a lot of teenage angst and anger because Raven had just told him she couldn't run away with him. That was how I understood the scene. Turns out in Act 2, when Raven's like, he's dead, that's not what happened. But I shouldn't have needed Raven to tell me that to understand that. Does that make sense? Similarly, I think was Tink's death, if you can even call it that, because all of the characters on stage were acting like she died and all of this and like getting very emotional. And then she just couple scenes later comes like running back as if nothing's happened. And so I'm like, okay, so I've clearly very much misinterpreted what I just watched. And as a result, you've had to tell me what I've just watched, which turns out it wasn't her dying. As I said, to me, it was just very unclear what was being done for like artsy symbolic reasons versus what was actually just a plot point. And because of that, I do feel like I said, it contributed to me feeling as though they were telling me as opposed to showing me. Because I'm like, okay, well, you didn't show me him dying. I could have got that. And so you could have cut the line where Raven's like, oh my God, he's dead. Because it's like, well, yeah, I would have seen that. And therefore the reveal of him not being dead would have been more. But I didn't think he died. So when it was revealed he wasn't dead, I was like, could have told you, babes. And so if you are going to show, not tell, can you please make sure that you're showing it in a way that actually makes it clear that something's happening? Moving moving on, one of my biggest gripes, from a long list of gripes with this show, was the choice to use handheld microphones. Do handheld mics give good sound? Yes, but there's a reason they aren't typically used in musical theatre, or theatre in general. For so much of this show, for me, it felt like the performances were trapped behind the microphone. We lost a lot of emotion and storytelling because you couldn't see the performers' faces very well and they had to do stuff one-handed. First, I actually thought this was like because of technical difficulties, because I could see a lot of the cast were mic'd up with your traditional like lav mics that they use in theatre, but it was when I noticed that lots of the costumes actually had mic loops on their belts that I realised it was actually a purposeful choice. Of course, shows like Six the Musical use handheld mics to great effect, but Six has worked these microphones into the choreography as well as the style of the show, which is obviously a concert. Bat Out of Hell isn't that, and so the microphones felt very out of place to me, and it often felt like the performers had no idea what to do with them, like when they weren't being used. And there were several moments it felt like they'd gone to start speaking and then had to remember to pick up their microphone, and that to me I think is what contributed to me thinking it was like a technical issue as opposed to like a conscious choice. I think this musical story-wise actually would have worked a lot better had they just stuck to your traditional theatre mics, because it would have allowed the performances to come across a lot better to the audience and not just vocally, if that makes sense. Another technical element that I think I struggled with throughout the show was this bloody cameraman that kept appearing. Now, no shade to Tom Samuels, the onstage videographer. I'm sure he's a lovely bloke, but the cameraman made me so irrationally angry. We could have scrapped him and the entire show would have been the same. He'd come on dressed all in black, like he was supposed to be backstage and got lost, and then he'd film primarily Sloane and Raven, and then by extension Falco and Strat. Now, I've seen musicals and plays use live camera feeds brilliantly effectively, but this is just not one of them. The footage on the screens was at times so dark and so lens flared that it was unwatchable, but you had to watch them because the bloody cameraman was in the way, blocking your view of the actors. There were times too, primarily during musical numbers, where it felt like the performers were performing to the camera when the audience is literally right there. And so again, I think it contributed on top of the handheld microphones to this feeling of the performance feeling like very trapped and isolated away from the audience. This camera thing just really didn't work for me. Okay, and we are on to my final point in the lowlights category. And I think, I don't really know a nicer way to phrase this, a lot of the show just made me uncomfortable. I could not shake this feeling when I was watching Sloane and Strat, that I was watching like that overly PDA couple from high school that just makes you feel a little bit queasy. Have you ever been at karaoke and there's this couple performing who are just like way too into the karaoke, but also like way too into each other, to the point where you feel like you need to turn away to give them some privacy? That's what a lot of this show felt like to me. Look, I can totally see why this show appeals to the middle-aged housewife with a husband that can't keep her satisfied, but to me, it was just uncomfortable to watch. The 60+ women around me were loving it. The whoops and cheers that went out every time Strat took his top off definitely confirmed this for me, but he just wasn't oozing the sex appeal I think they thought he was. Now, maybe this is a generational thing, but to me, he was creepy. Now, this is by no means a criticism of Glenn Adamson, who's been playing this role for a really long time, and I can see why with the charisma he brings to it, but Strat to me was just a little bit creepy. No, that makes it sound like he is creepy. He's kissing Tink, who is vaguely referred to as not 18 yet, like the rest of them, whilst he's been 18 for a very long time. His relationship with Raven has a weird sort of, not stalkerish, but like an unusual power dynamic going on between them. Like, she's naive and thinks she's in love with him. He's infatuated with her and uses that to his advantage. There's a lot going on. It was all just a little bit odd. Like, sure, everybody loves a bad boy.
We all like a bad boy though, don't we?
But not a fucking creeper though, Chris. I just can't quite put my finger on it, because clearly, like I said, the middle-aged housewives were loving it, right? Maybe it's because I'm not a middle-aged housewife. It just wasn't doing it for me. And this like sex, drugs and rock and roll energy just wasn't there. It just felt like, ugh. And again, weirdly, there wasn't a lot of chemistry between Strat and Raven, and maybe that's what contributed to this sort of odd dynamic I felt I was watching between the two of them. But yeah, I think if you take one thing away from it, it was that it felt like that weird, overly into each other couple doing karaoke to the point where you think they should just get a room and leave the rest of the bar out of it. Some of these thoughts weren't highlights and they weren't lowlights, but I did want to bring them up. And the main point here I think I want to make is that The show felt oddly cramped on the King's Theatre stage, and to me, it looked like they'd had to reblock some of it. Now, the King's Theatre in Portsmouth is literally the second stop of this brand new tour, so they've not done many shows yet, with the only prior stop to Portsmouth being the Edinburgh Playhouse. And these two venues couldn't be more different in size. Where the Edinburgh Playhouse's proscenium arch is 49 feet in width, the King's is only 30. And the stage width, sightline to sightline, of the King's Theatre is just about half of that of the Playhouse. And I bring all of these fun stage dimensions up because watching this show, it really did feel like the stage was too small and that reblocking had occurred as a result of that. The cast seemed quite cramped and the choreo and movement seemed hampered by the set. Because of this cramped look, it also weirdly gave me like school production vibes. You know, where the drama teacher's been told that they have to include as many students as possible, and so the ensemble for the show is just ridiculously big to the point where the whole ensemble disproportionately looks out of place on stage. That's how this felt. Now, I can't say for certain whether there is a case for saying it has been reblocked for this venue or not, but it did feel as though they were struggling for room, and I just can't help but wonder if that would feel different if I was watching it on a bigger stage like the stage at the Edinburgh Playhouse. So, to sum it all up, Bat Out of Hell was a bit of a mixed bag for me. The vocal performances were nothing short of fantastic, and the cast absolutely delivered on the powerhouse vocals I would expect from a kind of rock opera like this. Again, Georgia Bradshaw and Ryan Carter in particular were my standout performances here, with many of the performances really helping the Meatloaf songs to shine throughout. But beyond the music, I think the show is just struggling to find its footing, which is an odd thing to say given that it's been successful since 2017. The plot felt muddled and incomplete, with dropped storylines, unclear stakes, and unearned character arcs that just left me feeling a little bit disconnected from the story overall. Artistic choices like the cameraman and the handheld microphones really didn't appeal to me either, and I thought it actually detracted from the overall ability for the show to tell its story. They were more of a distraction than they were an enhancement, and the character dynamics, at least to me, were kind of uncomfortable to watch at times. The costumes had their moments, but I do think they relied too heavily on that kind of like rock musical stereotype, so I kind of wish, whilst I did like them, I'd seen something different. At the end of the day, for me, Bat Out of Hell didn't really ignite any sort of fire that I was hoping for it to bring. For the hardcore Meatloaf fans, the music alone in this show is definitely a reason to go and see it, and it carries its own weight in that sense. Certainly the Meatloaf fans around me were having the best night out. But as someone who isn't a fan of Meatloaf music and went into it more as a traditional musical theatre lover, I just kind of felt indifferent. There were definitely elements that had promise, but it all came together in a way which, at least to me, was just underwhelming. But if you yourself have seen Bat Out of Hell and have sat through this review either wholeheartedly agreeing with me or disagreeing completely, I would love to know your thoughts, feelings, and opinions, so do share those in the comments, as it's always fascinating to hear what different people have to say about different theatre productions. If it's more very opinionated musical theatre content that you're after, make sure you give this video a thumbs up and subscribe so you don't miss any more stagey content that's coming in the future. As always, I have been Flora, that has been my review of Bat Out of Hell on its new UK tour, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!